Hello and good evening, everybody, and I have two bits of good news for you. First of all, obviously, I am back. I know I took a little break last week. I had some personal business to attend to, but I am back in the swing of things, and I am pleased to give you episode 19 of Album Rant. Secondly, I'm sure you noticed in my previous episode, I was having some framing issues, and I have no idea how I did not catch that before uploading it, but needless to say, I seem to have fixed it, and I hope this provides a more fulfilling experience tonight. So anyways, now that we have that out of the way, tonight we are going to be taking subtlety and throwing it straight out the window, and we're going to be diving into the world of Whitesnake, and we're going to be looking at their 6th studio release entitled Slide It In. Yeah, I am sure you can figure out quite quickly what is being slid in and where it's being slid into. So, just to kind of figure out where we got here, as you probably know, Whitesnake is helmed by former Deep Purple vocalist David Coverdale. And I talked about this in my Deep Purple album ranking episode, but the very final album that he was on with Deep Purple was entitled Come Taste the Band. And by that point, the band had kind of shifted gears, and they were now kind of getting more into blues rock and funk music, which was a lot different than what had come before that. But anyways, on the Come Taste the Band tour, it was apparently a complete and total disaster. And eventually, or apparently, some of the other bandmates just kind of had a sit down with David Coverdale, and they're like, man, there is no band left. It's over. And so therefore the band pretty much dissipated and they went on hiatus for 8 years. But David Coverdale put a few guys together, most notably Bernie Marsden on lead guitar, Micky Moody on lead guitar, Neil Murray on bass, and Dave Doyle, I believe that's his name, on the drums. And they released an EP entitled Snakebite. And it was kind of flat, and it got mediocre reviews. But then, the following year, in 1978, they put out their first studio release, not their first studio release, their first actual album entitled Trouble. And this time, former and longtime Deep Purple keyboardist Jon Lord would be joining them. And it was kind of flat, and it got mediocre reviews. But they bounced back in 1979 and put out their second studio album entitled Love Hunter. And it was kind of flat, and it got mediocre reviews. But then in 1980, Dave Doyle was swapped out on the drums for former Deep Purple drummer and the only member who was on every single Deep Purple album, Ian Pace. And they released their third studio album entitled Ready and Willing. And it was kind of flat, and it got mediocre reviews. But they came back the next year, and they released Come and Get It. And it was kind of flat, and it got mediocre reviews. But fifth time is the charm, allegedly. And in 1982, they released their fifth studio album entitled Saints and Sinners. And it was kind of flat, and it got mediocre reviews, but it did include 2 tracks entitled Crying in the Rain and Here I Go Again that were later re-recorded later in the 80s, and it was much more successful then. But before that happened, they put out their 6th studio release, and this is the CD edition, and it was entitled Slide It In. And it was kind of flat, and it got mediocre reviews. I mean, a lot of the members were swapped out on this one. Neil Murray was swapped out for Colin Hodgkinson. And who else? Ian Pace was swapped out for the great and the late Cozy Powell. But then after that, the following year, what happened was they remixed the album, and a couple members were swapped out. Colin Hodgkinson was out, and Neil Murray was back in. and Micky Moody was out, and he was replaced by John Sykes. And this right here is the remixed edition. You can see right there, if I can zoom in a little bit, the track list is a little bit different, as you can see. I mean, it's the same tracks, but they are rearranged a little bit. And Keith Olsen also remixed everything just a little bit. Like I said, the guitars and the bass were swapped out for two other members who gave it a nice, crisp, more slick production. And it was definitely shifting away from blues rock, and it was more heavy metal. Now, personally, I think I actually do like the original release better. I actually like that more raw sound that it has, but each version has its fans, and I definitely recognize that both versions have something to offer. But anyways, as you can see right here, we have the original release, we have the re-recording and the remix from 1985. And what I'm going to be reviewing tonight is actually the 2019 35th anniversary remix. So as you can see right here, we have a lot of different versions of this album. It has often been called, well, actually only by me, the Blade Runner of album records. And seeing how Blade Runner is a film that was released in 1982 that has gone through many different director's cuts and many different versions, and just like that film, Slide It In has also gone through a bunch of different versions, and there are lots of versions of Slide It In, just like there's lots of versions of Blade Runner. So let's go ahead and see what we have right here in the insert. Now, as you can see right over here, we have some lyrics, and they're sleazy, as you've probably guessed. Right here, we have the original lineup. It was David Coverdale on vocals, Mel Galley on guitars, Jon Lord on keyboards, Micky Moody on guitars, Colin Hodgkinson on bass, and Cozy Powell on the drums. Then down here, the US remix swapped out a few people. John Sykes is now on guitar, and Neil Murray is back on bass. Well, this is a remix of the 1985 release. So I hope you're not confused by that at this point, but that is what it is. So looking over here on side one, we have the title track, Slide It In. It's very fast. It's got a pretty catchy beat to it, but yes, the lyrics are pretty ridiculous and leave little to the imagination. But then we have Slow and Easy. And this is a very, very bluesy number that is just oozing with sexual tension. And I like it, actually. I know you might be thinking that it may not quite be my thing, seeing how it's more of a blues song, but I think everything about it flows together very well. Okay, they played that both times that I saw them in concert, and it was quite an experience. Then we have Love Ain't No Stranger, which is probably the most mainstream sounding song on here, but it's definitely radio bait, and I believe it did come on the radio quite a bit. Cozy Powell has actually said that is the greatest song he's ever appeared on. I'm not sure if I agree with that. I do like the song, but if I had to pick a favorite from side one, it's probably Slow and Easy. Now, as we move on to side two, we have Give Me More Time, which is more radio bait, but I think this one flows together and is a much better song than Love Ain't No Stranger. I'm sure you've probably heard that one before, but I actually do really like it. Guilty of Love is probably one of the weakest songs on here. I know it typically appears on their greatest hits albums, but I just found it a little bit too much diving into pop rock, and didn't really care for Guilty of Love. But if you love it, no pun intended, if you're guilty of loving it, more power to you. Then we have All or Nothing, which is a little bit slower, but still pretty memorable. But my favorite from side two is definitely Give Me More Time. Then we come to side three. We have Spit It Out. I'm not going to say much more. It's a very, very silly song. The lyrics leave very little to the imagination, but it's pretty good for what it is. Standing in the Shadow is kind of slower than what came before. It's a little bit slower than Spit It Out, and it doesn't leave as big of an impression. I mean, Spit It Out is absolutely horrible. Standing in the Shadow is kind of forgettable, so I'm kind of torn on which one I would prefer. But having said that, I would prefer Hungry for Love over both of them. Hungry for Love has a nice groovy intro to it, and believe it or not, the rhythm, I think I might be the only person who's ever pointed this out. Well, I've never heard anybody else point this out, but I definitely agree with this. I think the rhythm sounds a lot like It's Only Rock and Roll by the Rolling Stones. There's something about both of them that seem to be very, very similar with each other. But Hungry for Love is most certainly my favorite from side 3 on record 2. Then it concludes with side 4, and we have Gambler, which was off the original release, and it was actually the very first track on the original release. It got moved to the very back on the 2019 remix. It's also a lot slower, and it doesn't leave too much of an impression. But we actually have a bonus track on this one, and it's Need Your Love So Bad. I think it was released as a B-side to a single, and I don't really care for it. So my favorite from side 4 is most definitely Gambler, and I did not have to think about that one. My favorite throughout the entire record is probably Slow and Easy. That song is too classic, it is too amazing, and I cannot get enough of that one. I mean, it starts out very, very slow, then it starts building up, but it's always got this very sleazy nature to it, and it's always got a nice little bluesy rhythm, which I definitely really respect. So that right there was Slide It In, the 35th anniversary remix. And honestly, the reason I bought the remix when I was getting this album on vinyl is because I already had the original version. I already had the 1985 re-recording, so I'm like, I already have these two versions. Why get the same version twice? I might as well get something I hadn't heard before. And it actually is a pretty decent remix. I know remixes often get a lot of flack because they're just so unnecessary, but I think they actually did achieve something with this remix. Most remixes are terrible, but I think this one actually is pretty solid, and I would suggest checking it out. If you don't like it, I understand that, but I think it is worth a listen. But really, which version is my favorite? It's hard to say. They all bring something to the table. I think if I had to pick one up, like if I had to listen to this album and I had to make a choice as to which version, I probably would go with the 2019 35th anniversary remix, just because I've heard it the least. Does that mean it's the best one? Probably not, because my opinion may shift any other day. If I had to answer the question, which one do I think is the best, I probably would have gone with the original, but again, ask me another day and maybe something different. So I just want to put that out there, that there are different versions. There are at least 3 different versions of this album, and I think it is a great album. I highly recommend this. This is Whitesnake, close to their very best, and I think every fan of heavy metal or blues rock should pick this up and listen to at least one of these versions, because it does not get enough credit. So that is going to conclude tonight's episode of Album Rant. Next time, we're going to watch a band get their wings, but until then, have a very pleasant evening.